should have brought silence. Instead, it brought fire. Troy burned beneath a sky that offered no answer. Flames climbed its towers like accusation. Stone cracked. Bronze screamed. And the illusion of safety, held for 10 years, collapsed in a single night. The gates had been opened, not by force, by belief. The wooden horse stood within the walls, once a symbol of victory. Now it stood as a wound. From within it, the war returned. Greek soldiers spilled into the city like shadows given form, silent, precise, merciless. Doors opened from inside. Fires were set where none should exist. And before Troy could fully awaken, it was already dying. Aeneas woke to collapse, not distant, not imagined, immediate. The air was thick with smoke, and something heavier, final. He stepped outside, and Troy no longer existed in any stable form. Screams moved through the streets. Fire painted everything in unstable red. Figures ran on instinct. Soldiers clashed in narrow passages, frantic, uncoordinated. This was not battle. This was the end of one. For a moment, Aeneas felt the pull of instinct, to fight, to stand, to die with honor beneath his city's walls. But something stopped him. Not fear. Something deeper. A thought beyond instinct. Consequence. And he hesitated. The hesitation felt wrong, but it did not leave. Troy was not under attack. Troy was already lost. A section of wall collapsed in the distance. Stone and dust rose like the city, exhaling its final breath. There would be no victory, only choices, and choices made now would define everything that followed. A wounded soldier stumbled through smoke. "They're everywhere," he gasped. "Inside the city." Aeneas said nothing. He already knew. The truth arrived slowly, like ash settling. He turned toward home, not toward battle, toward something more fragile. Inside, the air felt smaller, heavier. His father sat as he always had. Anchises did not need to see the flames. "It has come," he said quietly. Not a question. Recognition. Aeneas stepped forward. "We have to leave." The words felt unnatural, not wrong, but impossible against everything he had been taught. Anchises looked at him, then shook his head. "I will not abandon this city. I was born here. I will die here." No anger, only certainty. The certainty of a life already lived. Aeneas felt something tighten in his chest. This is not choice anymore. It is survival. But even as he said it, he knew survival was not the point. Survival without meaning is only delay. Outside, collapse grew louder, closer. Time no longer moved forward. It closed in. Aeneas looked at his father, not as a soldier looks at command, but as a son facing what cannot be carried easily. Then he made the decision. He knelt and lifted Anchises onto his shoulders. The old man resisted, not with force, but with principle. But principle does not stand against inevitability, and inevitability had already entered Troy. Aeneas stood, adjusting to the weight, not only physical, symbolic, past, memory. Behind him, his son moved close. Aeneas, the future. Aeneas did not look back. He could feel him there. That was enough. 3 generations bound into a single moment. They stepped into the burning city, not as defenders, but as those who chose something harder than dying. They chose to leave. The streets were collapsing now. Structures fell in seconds. Fire spread without direction, consuming homes, temples, memory itself. No one moved with purpose, only reaction. Aeneas moved differently, not faster, not stronger, but with clarity. Each step rejected what was behind him. Each step forward committed to what he could not yet see. A soldier rushed past. "Why are you leaving?" he shouted. "We can still fight." Aeneas did not answer. Some battles are lost before they are recognized, and fighting them does not change the outcome, only how long it takes to accept it. The gates of Troy stood open, not broken by force, but by deception. Beyond them, night stretched into uncertainty. Aeneas stopped once, turned back. Troy burned completely now. Everything he had known, everything he had been, ending, not gradually, not symbolically, completely. Anchises spoke quietly. "Do not look back too long." Aeneas did not answer. Looking back is not memory, it is attachment. And attachment becomes a chain still. He looked once more, not as warrior, not as defender, but as witness. Then he turned away and stepped into a future that did not yet exist. The sea does not mourn what is lost. It only carries it away. Behind them, Troy had already become memory, dissolving into smoke and distance. Its glow no longer burned with detail, only impression, a fading scar swallowed by night and waves. And yet, it did not feel like escape. It felt like suspension, as if the world had not decided what they were yet. Survivors, or remnants, on a small vessel cutting through dark water. Aeneas stood at the edge, staring back. But Troy was gone now. Not physically, emotionally. What remained was absence of belonging, Behind him, Anchises sat quietly, recovering from the weight of departure. He had spoken little since they left, not from weakness, but from certainty being stripped away. Beside them, Aeneas watched everything with quiet intensity. Looked at him. The boy was too young to fully grasp loss, but old enough to feel something essential had disappeared. A foundation removed before memory could stabilize it. The sea shifted beneath them, indifferent. Days blurred. Time lost structure. Temples, cities, gone. Time became fluid, unstable, and with it came uncertainty, not only of direction, but of purpose. Aeneas was no longer a warrior defending a homeland. He was a man carrying what remained of one, and there is no instruction for what comes after that. At night, when the sea calmed, he would stare into the horizon, as if expecting something to answer the silence Troy left behind. But silence does not answer. It expands. Anchises finally spoke. "We are being guided." Aeneas turned slightly. "By what?" Anchises did not answer at first. His gaze remained fixed upward. "The gods do not abandon bloodlines easily." Aeneas said nothing, because belief here was not certainty. It was necessity, and necessity is a fragile form of faith. Unseen forces shape their journey more than wind or tide. Storms should have destroyed them, but shifted. Paths should have been lost, but cleared without reason. And Aeneas began to notice, not as comfort, but pressure. Something was guiding them, and guidance without explanation is its own uncertainty. He thought of Aphrodite, not myth, not distance, but presence, origin, something that had marked him before understanding. He was not fully mortal, not fully separate from the divine, and that mattered now, because if the gods were involved, then this was not escape, it was continuation. Eventually, the sea gave way to land, a coastline unfamiliar, untouched by memory. The ships approached slowly, uncertain whether the world ahead would accept them or reject them. This place was not Troy, not home, only land. And at this point, land was enough. They stepped ashore into silence, broken only by wind through unknown trees. The air felt different, lighter, but colder in its unfamiliarity. Aeneas felt it immediately. This place did not know them, and therefore, it did not care. That absence of recognition was unsettling. In Troy, even in war, there had been identity, meaning embedded in every stone. Here, there was none. Only possibility. But possibility without direction is emptiness. They built a temporary camp, nothing permanent, only survival shaped into structure. That night, Aeneas walked the perimeter, listening to unfamiliar sounds of a world that did not belong to him. Anchises rested. Ascanius slept lightly, as children do when the world is unstable. Aeneas remained awake, because leaders do not sleep easily when the future is undefined. Near the forest's edge, he felt something unusual, not threat, not danger, awareness, as if the world itself was observing them. Then she appeared, not suddenly, not dramatically, but as if she had always belonged to the space, and only now became visible. Aphrodite stood before him in a way that did not fully obey physical reality. Aeneas stopped, not in fear, but recognition. Something in him already knew her. "You have come far," she said softly. Her voice did not echo. It settled. "I have come without direction," he replied. "That is not the same," she said. Silence stretched. Aeneas did not kneel, not defiance. Form itself felt uncertain here. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Aphrodite tilted her head. "Nothing. You already carry what is required." The answer did not clarify. It deepened uncertainty. Aeneas felt reality tighten slightly around him, the sense that his path was not random, even if unseen. "You are being led," she said, "not away from Troy, forward from it." The words lingered. Loss, reframed, not ending, but transition. Aeneas looked to the sea. "Where?" he asked quietly. Aphrodite did not answer directly. "You will know when it becomes necessary to know." And then she was gone. Not departure, not disappearance, just absence, as if she had never interrupted reality at all. Aeneas stood alone at the edge of the unknown world, but not entirely alone in thought. Something had shifted, not direction, not clarity, but expectation. This journey was not aimless. It was shaped. And somewhere ahead, beyond sea, beyond land, beyond understanding, something awaited. Not an end, but a beginning not yet revealed. Aeneas turned back toward the camp. The future was still invisible, but it was no longer empty. And that changed everything. The sea no longer felt like escape. It felt like passage, as if every wave carried them not away from something, but towards something already decided. On the horizon, Carthage took shape. Not promise, not threat, just presence becoming real. And with it came relief. Careful, uncertain. For the first time since Troy's fall, the world did not feel hostile. The wind was calmer, the waters steadier. Even the land held itself with quiet order. not home, but safety. And after destruction, safety can feel like peace. Aeneas stepped ashore cautiously, watching the city rise in the distance, walls under construction, movement with purpose, a place forming itself into structure. Carthage was becoming, and in that, there was familiarity. A city still shaping identity, like Troy once had. Beside him, Aeneas looked around with quiet curiosity. Children adapt faster. They do not carry full memory of loss. But Aeneas did, and Anchises did. Anchises studied the land in silence, not distrust, but awareness. The kind born from knowing calm does not guarantee permanence. They were received not as enemies, but as survivors. And that distinction mattered more than it should have, because being welcomed after destruction creates an illusion that suffering has ended, that arrival is completion. They were brought into the city, and there she was, Dido. She did not enter as authority being performed. She already was authority, not declared, but embodied. The city moved with her, as if aligned. She studied them carefully, not with suspicion, but with recognition shaped by loss, because she, too, was building from absence. When she spoke, there was no distance. You are far from home. Aeneas met her gaze. We have no home. She did not react, because she understood. Silence followed, heavy, not empty. Then she offered hospitality, not only duty, but empathy shaped by experience. Shelter, food, rest, and for the first time since Troy burned, stillness returned. Days passed, then weeks. The Trojans began to breathe differently. Tension loosened. Nothing collapsed here. Nothing burned. Nights were quiet in unfamiliar ways, and Aeneas felt it too. The easing of burden. The suggestion that survival had reached its end. That movement might stop. That rest might be allowed. Dido and Aeneas spoke often, not only of war or history, but of loss, leadership, and the strange similarity between building from nothing and rebuilding from ashes. In those conversations, something formed, not sudden, not declared. Recognition becoming understanding, understanding becoming connection, connection becoming something more fragile. Affection. Aeneas did not mark the moment it shifted, or chose not to, because naming gives weight, and he already carried too much. Aphrodite watched from unseen distance, not interfering, only observing the fragile balance where safety replaced chaos. But peace built on uncertainty does not hold. It only delays fracture. Dido offered him something he had not known since Troy burned. A future that did not feel like exile. A place where stopping was possible. Where survival did not require suffering. And for a moment, Aeneas allowed it. Not as betrayal, but as possibility. What if survival was not only movement? What if it could also mean remaining? The thought did not last, but it stayed. Quiet, undermining certainty. One evening Aeneas stood at Carthage's edge, watching the horizon, not for danger, but for direction. And then he felt it again. Not voice, not command, pressure. Something beyond human will remembering him, not as survivor, not as guest, but as one still unfinished. He did not turn immediately when he felt Dido approach. He already knew. She stood beside him, silent at first, then softly, "You are not meant to stay here." Aeneas closed his eyes, not in denial, but recognition, because part of him already knew, but another part, newly formed, fragile, human, wanted her to be wrong. "I do not know what I'm meant for," he said. Dido stepped closer. "Then stay until you do." And for the first time, staying did not feel impossible. It felt natural, almost right. But beyond Carthage, beyond peace, something waited, unfinished, unmoved, unforgiving, and Aeneas stood between two truths that could not coexist: rest and destiny, and neither would yield easily. There are moments when silence is not peace. It is delay. In Carthage, that delay had stretched into something resembling life. Not the life Aeneas knew in Troy, defined by duty, urgency, survival, but something slower, softer, almost fragile enough to believe in. And that was what made it dangerous. Aeneas no longer moved as a man escaping destruction. He moved as a man offered the illusion that destruction had already ended. Carthage did not demand anything, and that absence of demand became its temptation. At its center stood Dido, not only ruler, but something more human in private moments. A woman who had built order from exile, who understood loss not as memory, but foundation. In her presence, Aeneas felt something unfamiliar form, not weakness, not distraction, but rest. And rest for him was not neutral, it was transformative. The city reflected that illusion. Construction continued. Trade expanded. Stability deepened. Carthage felt less like refuge and more like a future already in motion. And Aeneas, despite every instinct shaped by Troy's ashes, began to participate. Not fully, not consciously, but enough. Time softened. Days became continuity instead of survival. And in that continuity, something grew between him and Dido that neither war nor loss had prepared him to name. It did not begin as love as stories define it. It began as recognition without resistance. Two people shaped by collapse, finding structure in each other that did not immediately break. But even structure built on understanding can become a prison if it is not meant to last. And something was watching, not as mortals watch, but as fate watches what it has already marked. One evening, the sky over Carthage changed, not violently, but subtly, as if the air had remembered something long ignored. That night, Aeneas dreamed, not of Troy, but of motion, endless sea, unfinished roads, a presence pressing inward without language. He woke before dawn, and peace did not return. Instead, pressure, not external, internal. The sense that his life had stopped moving where it was meant to continue. He did not speak of it, because naming it would force confrontation. But silence does not resist divine intention. It only delays it. And delay, in the presence of fate, is temporary. Aphrodite had not interfered since Carthage, but she had not been absent. Her presence was distance, measured, deliberate, as if waiting for inevitability to complete itself. Then it happened. Not command, but awareness becoming unavoidable. Aeneas was summoned, not by voice alone, but by convergence, pressure, presence, inevitability. The air felt different at the city's edge, as if the boundary between choice and obligation had thinned. And then he understood, not fully, but enough. He was not meant to remain. Carthage was not destination. It was interruption. A beautiful interruption, but still interruption. Behind him, footsteps. He did not need to turn. Dido stood there, and stillness returned for a moment. Fragile, almost convincing. "You are leaving," she said. Not a question, a recognition. Aeneas did not answer immediately. Words would make it real. Finally, "I did not choose this moment." Dido's voice stayed steady, but something beneath it shifted. "And yet you will obey it." It was not accusation, it was accuracy. Aeneas turned slightly. "I have carried too many lives to pretend my own is only mine." Dido stepped closer. "And I built a city that finally let me stop running." Silence stretched, not empty, full of everything that could not survive being spoken further. Dido spoke again, quieter. If you leave, what remains here? Aeneas hesitated. The honest answer was not kind. I do not know. And that was the cruelty, because destiny never explains what it leaves behind. It only moves. Dido looked at him, not pleading, not breaking, but understanding, and that made it heavier. You were never mine to keep, she said. Aeneas closed his eyes briefly. Finality without accusation cannot be undone. Somewhere beyond Carthage, the sea continued, indifferent, constant. When he opened his eyes again, something had shifted. Not decision, alignment, with something larger than comfort. Dido stepped back, not from weakness, but from understanding that some departures are already complete. Aeneas spoke once more, quieter. I am sorry. And it was not enough, because it never is. Dido turned away, not in anger, but in recognition that staying longer would only fracture what remained. And in that turning away, something in Carthage ended, not visibly, irreversibly. Aeneas remained long after she left, because departure is not a moment. It is what remains after choice has already been made. And in that space, the cost of destiny became real. The sea did not feel forgiving anymore. It felt familiar in its indifference. As Troy's survivors left Carthage behind, there was no celebration, no relief, only motion returning, slow, unavoidable, the kind that does not ask readiness. It simply continues. Behind them, the city remained, not destroyed, not diminished, but changed in meaning. And somewhere within it, Dido remained, wrapped in a silence that would outlive words. Aeneas did not look back, not because it was easy, but because looking back had already done its damage. Now there was only forward, but forward no longer felt like escape. It felt like obligation resuming its shape. Days passed at sea, and something in Aeneas changed. The brief illusion of rest left a residue, an awareness that peace could exist, but not for him. Not yet. Not fully. The weight he carried, Anchises, Ascanius, and memory of loss, no longer felt like survival alone. It felt like direction without explanation, and direction without explanation becomes something else. Purpose, or burden, or both. Eventually, the sea gave way again. This time, the land did not feel merely unfamiliar. It felt resistant, as if it did not yet accept them as part of its story. Italy, a place not yet shaped into the narrative Aeneas had been told he belonged to. But it was there, waiting. They landed carefully, not as conquerors, not as refugees, but as something between, survivors still being written into a larger design. The air was different, denser with possibility. But possibility is not comfort. It is uncertainty given form. Aeneas understood immediately. This land did not belong to him. And worse, it did not yet know if it ever would. At first, there was silence, observation, attempts to understand those who already lived there, rules, boundaries, unseen tensions beneath the surface. But silence in new lands does not last. Tension formed, not immediately as war, but as recognition of overlap. Two futures occupying the same ground, and future, when shared without agreement, becomes conflict. Local tribes did not see prophecy. They saw intrusion. Aeneas did not see invasion. He saw continuation. Neither was entirely wrong, which made resolution impossible. Negotiation failed where identity was absolute, and soon conflict began, not yet war in its full form. Skirmishes, misunderstandings, boundaries tested through force instead of words. Aeneas did not seek war, but he did not avoid it, because avoidance would mean abandoning meaning, and meaning, once accepted, cannot be discarded. The conflict was not about conquest. It was about existence, about whether Troy's survivors had a place in a world that had already moved on. Each battle carried weight beyond strategy. Each victory felt temporary. Each loss felt personal. Aeneas moved not as a seeker of glory, but as someone aware destiny does not pause. It only continues. In moments of stillness, he stood apart from the camp, listening to a land resisting integration. And Carthage returned to him, not as regret, but contrast. A life that could have paused, a life that did not. Aphrodite remained unseen, but not absent. Her presence lingered in structure itself. Survival where none should exist. Protection where collapse was expected. But protection does not erase cost. It redistributes it. As conflict grew, it became clear this was not temporary resistance. It was something larger, a shaping of identity itself. And Aeneas began to understand this was not only survival, it was legitimacy, the right to belong to a future that did not yet recognize them. One evening, after battle, Aeneas stood alone on a ridge. Smoke rose in the distance, not only destruction, but consequence. He was no longer the man who left Troy, nor the man who stayed in Carthage. Something had layered over him through repetition, not transformation, accumulation. Each choice added weight. Each loss added structure. And now, something in him approached completion. Anchises joined him, older, now in a way that felt closer to memory than life. "You are carrying too much," he said softly. Aeneas did not answer immediately, because it was true beyond simplification. "I carry what was given," he said finally. Anchises nodded. "And what is given is not always meant to be carried alone." Silence followed, not disagreement, but understanding without solution. Far beyond them, conflict continued, not resolving, not concluding, only evolving. Because wars of identity do not end quickly. They reshape everything they touch. And Aeneas, whether chosen or not, was now part of something larger than survival. He was part of formation, of something not yet named. And ahead, beyond conflict, exhaustion, uncertainty, there was a future still forming. Not reward, but consequence. Aeneas turned back toward the camp. The war was not over. It was only becoming inevitable. The world does not remember moments. It remembers what survives them. And by the time the final conflict reached its end, nothing about the land felt unchanged. Not the soil, not the people, not even the air that had carried the weight of war for too long. But something had been decided, not cleanly, not peacefully, but irreversibly. Aeneas stood at the edge of the aftermath, surrounded not by triumph, but by exhaustion that had settled into the landscape itself. This was not victory in the way songs would later pretend. It was continuation after resistance stopped being enough to matter. Beside him, the presence of loss felt layered rather than singular. Not one death, not one sacrifice, but the accumulation of every cost that had led here. Troy, Carthage, the sea, the wars that followed arrival. All of it pressed into silence. Anchises was gone now, not in presence, but in absence that had already begun shaping meaning before his departure. The kind of absence that does not simply remove a person, it reorganizes everything they once anchored. And Aeneas stood where future now existed, no longer only a child carried through fire and sea, but a continuation that no longer required protection in the same way. Something had transferred, slowly, inevitably. Aeneas understood, finally, that he was no longer only a survivor. He was a transition point, a bridge between destruction and what comes after destruction learns how to organize itself. The war had ended not because one side was fully erased, but because exhaustion had replaced resistance. Agreements formed not from peace, but from recognition that continuation required structure, and structure requires compromise. Italy would not be one story immediately, but it would become one eventually, and in that becoming, something new was born. Not a city yet, not an empire yet, but the beginning of one. Aeneas walked through the land that would later remember him differently than he remembered himself. He was aware of that distance already forming, the space between lived experience and future interpretation, because history does not preserve exhaustion. It preserves outcome, and outcomes simplify what was never simple. As night approached, Aeneas stood alone once more. The sky above Italy was unchanged, but his perception of it was not. He had looked at the same sky over Troy, over the sea, over Carthage, but it had never felt like this. Finality was not a moment. It was recognition that movement had found direction that could no longer be undone. And then, as if the weight of everything he had carried required acknowledgement beyond memory alone, something within him settled. Not peace, not relief, but acceptance shaped through endurance. He understood now what had been unfolding all along. Troy was not the end of his story. It was its beginning in disguise. Carthage was not escape. It was interruption meant to test whether desire could override purpose. And Italy, this land of conflict, resistance, and eventual formation, was not reward. It was result, the consequence of continuing when stopping would have been easier. Aeneas closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment, he was no longer just a man carrying the weight of gods, memory, and survival. He was something quieter, something less defined by struggle, a name that would outlive the person it belonged to, not because he sought it, but because it was what remained when everything else had been stripped away. And somewhere far beyond mortal understanding, the threads of fate that had followed him since Troy no longer needed to intervene. Their work had already been completed. What was left now belonged to those who would come after. When Aeneas opened his eyes again, the world did not look different, but it felt complete in a way it never had before. Not finished, but established. He turned toward the future, not as something unknown, but as something now inevitable, and walked forward, not as a hero seeking glory, not as a refugee seeking shelter, but as the beginning of a legacy that would outlast him entirely.